You do not need to be approved to be in the passive house market.
Yeah.
All you
Yeah.
need to do is show us the efficiencies of the product.
Just
So
comes down to how effective is that facade company or product able to solve the problem and still maintain the cost control that's needed for the job.
Well, thank you both for joining. This is going to be a Passive House themed episode, and I know you two have had a long-standing collaboration that goes way back, probably beyond maybe Spencer, your professional career. So I have a bunch of questions for you, Lois, but before we go there, it might be good for, well, I've heard it from Spencer's side. So yeah, from Lois's perspective, where you two met.
was it Cornell, Spencer? Did we
I think it was during it was the Passive House training in
Oh,
Boston
we were in the same
with
training.
Katrin. Yeah. So
You know
we
how
were
many
in
people?
that was in like
10.
2009. It was one of the first,
Yep.
maybe it was the third. I think it was like the third class that
Yep.
occurred in the US. And that's where we met. It was like the very beginning of the whole kind of passive house movement in the US in terms of, engaging beyond just the single family home market and kind of engaging people more from the industry and commercial work. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I was still in college back then. That was a long time ago.
Shut up.
Yeah. Yeah, it was at Mass Art. And we were doing the solar decathlon and we were trying to figure out how to do a passive house for the solar decathlon,
Oh,
which
nice.
wasn't a very good idea, but we thought it was at the time, right? So we were like, well, we have to go through the training because no one else knew how to do it. And yeah, that's where we met.
That's
So
awesome. That's
yeah.
I
awesome.
mean, I think so. For a little bit of context, when kind of Schuko and Skyline came together, and Spencer and I really began sort of a deep collaboration, I found it somewhat humorous that he's this quote unquote passive house guru, but for the past decade, nobody seemed to care, and all of a sudden, it's so relevant, and it's maybe code based, whatever the case might be. Maybe now that we have really good case studies under our belt, people are open to the conversation. But here's this guy for the past 10 years knocking on people's doors and nobody wanted to hear from him. So I know Spencer's background, but like, I guess from your standpoint, call it a decade ago, Lois, why did you care? Where did you see the opportunity? And, along the way, did you lose hope because you weren't gaining traction and sort of pushing this movement?
So it's kind of an interesting story. I was working at Stephen Winter as a research engineer. So we were doing applied research for the Department of Energy for their Building America program. And we were really working with production builders at the time, single family home builders, trying to get their housing stock like 30% better than Energy Star. So really sort of pushing the limits for them. And I was in the office and I got a call. Someone was like, "Do you guys do passive house? Can you do that modeling?" And I was like, "Of course." Engineers always say, "Of course," right? So and then I got two other calls within a 2-week period. So I've got 3 calls asking about passive house in a very short amount of time, and I had never heard of it before. So I was researching it, and then I was like, "Oh, this is going to be something." And so I talked to Steven and I said, I need to go through this training. I think it would be good for us. And he was like, "Oh God, it's so expensive, and I don't know about this, And so he reluctantly let me go to the Boston training, and right after we finished, we got our first larger project, the Eco Village co-housing community up in
Oh
Ithaca.
yeah.
And then
Yeah.
right after that, we got Cornell. So the 26-story
Wow.
tower. And it's never stopped since.
Yeah.
So it was not frustrating. It was like overwhelming because we were getting these enormous buildings that nobody's ever done before, even the certifying bodies. And so we were
Right.
pulling them along with us. And like, well, if you can apply it to anything, let's apply it, and working through all the kinks and the things that it wasn't set up to do originally that it's now set up to do. So it was quite exciting. It was sort of like a continuation of being a research engineer because we were just doing like the first of everything. And so it was like an exciting time. It was when I went the most gray.
Which, when on I haven't been as thoroughly involved as Spencer has with Stephen Winter Associates on these projects, and I think I would say you probably wear different hats on different projects. But would you sort of describe it as like a bridge between a facade consultant, an architect, a mechanical consultant? Like what's the real sort of differentiator role you play on these projects that maybe might fall out of the wheelhouse of those typical entities?
That's a good, no one's ever asked it that way before. You're right, we're sort of like a little bow tie on a package, right? Like we're checking everybody's stuff to make sure they're in compliance. We're not telling them how to design it. We're just saying, no, you have to make that more efficient, or this doesn't meet the requirements of the program, and doing the modeling and the thermal bridge modeling and just making sure that overall the building works well as a system. And so it was funny. So I'll give you an example. So for Handel, when we did the first air barrier review for them on Cornell, and I'm going through and I'm circling all the little transition areas that I need details from them. And they looked at me like, are you crazy? Like, this is insane. But after they did that project, they're like, now we have them. We know what it takes. It does, it's like, it's now we have a toolkit over here. So it's stuff like that. And like for the mechanical engineers, it's like, measuring the length of domestic hot water pipe that they're in recommending for the building and saying, no, that's way too much. You're hurting your overall efficiency, and working with them to come up with a more efficient design. We don't say, do it this way. We say, these are the standard design types that result in less piping and losses. But so yeah, we're constantly interacting with the whole team. It's a very integrated design approach. Everybody has to be at the table at the beginning of the design, or it doesn't work well. It doesn't work smoothly. We've had it where they're not, and it doesn't work smoothly. Yeah.
What is it? Do you have a lot of involvement in Boston at the moment, just given the new stretch energy code for new construction? It's the one market where between GCs, owners, facade consultants, designers, everybody wants to talk about passive house right now.
I know it's going bonkers. Like we write proposal after proposal. We're not, it's not like we're winning it all, but like it's really gone haywire. I think the Boston office will outstrip the New York office in the next few years. And right now we have 5 people up there.
Well, so I'm happy Spencer's here because he's experienced it. We've had Handel on here, we've had FX Collaborative on here, and I was in a facade consultant's office last week in Boston, and they're talking about this passive house approach. We had Eastern on as well. So sort of from the contractor to design team, a lot of people on here talking about the experience. And it seems like on Cornell, everybody went like overly conservative because, excuse me, they didn't want to fuck it up, in terms of how many air barrier layers and the detailing and the execution on the project, and maybe having 3 superintendents watching to ensure everything was being installed properly. And they did it, and they checked the box and they got the certification. But do you find design teams are becoming a little more risk on, or in terms of their detailing? Is there a level of confidence, or do people err more on the conservative side just to ensure? I mean, I think part of the problem is reality in Boston is it's like you need to design to passive house level standards to meet code, but they don't necessarily need the certification. That's just sort of like an add-on, a benefit. But if they don't get the certification, there's no consequences. So, I mean, do you find if like people buy into we're going passive house versus not, there's a clear sort of delineation, or like one goes well versus one can go awry? I mean, what I find a lot of projects, and I'll end this ramble in a second, that it's like they set such a high bar and standards in the beginning of the project, and then as things go on and things progress, and it's all about schedule, it's all about GMP, it's all about TCO, just things kind of go downhill. So with that passive house certification in mind, it keeps the bar at this level all the way through.
Yeah. So the thing about Mass is they have to at least pass all the tests and make sure that their modeling results say, yes, you meet all the criteria, or they're not supposedly going to get their final occupancy. So there's some language coming out that's going to it should sunset in a few years, that if they miss their blower door test by a little, they can still occupy their building, right? Like they have to show that they tried to remediate it. They have to show that they tested again. They have, stuff that's not cheap. So it's pretty strict. So we should be seeing product come out of Massachusetts that's just right on the money as far as certification goes, even if they don't have a certificate, because it takes, let's be honest, it takes forever to get that certificate. You can't be waiting 6 months to occupy your building because we can't get a certificate, right? Yeah. So that's the thing. But to your question, when people say I'm building to the standard versus actually testing and inspecting to the standard, there is a significant difference in the overall performance at the end, and the ongoing utility performance. From the small sample set we saw, a few years back, it's about 20% more energy use in the buildings that said, we're going to go to the standard, but not actually pursue certification. So if I have a client that's really adamant about the performance of the building, but the certificate doesn't really mean anything, I just say, don't tell your contractors. Don't tell your contractors you're not getting certified, right? Everything needs to go into specs. We're doing all the testing, we're doing all the inspections, because that's really where the quality comes in. That's what makes the difference. So they have to think they need to pass all those tests.
It's smart. It's smart. So to go beyond that, and we asked the handout folks this as well. Have you been back to Cornell or any of these projects? And I guess let's tee it up with the first question. Do you notice a difference in Passive House certified buildings?
Yeah, we have utility data now from about a dozen certified buildings that have been in operation for well over a year. And they're performing about 40 to 50% better than standard code built buildings, same type, same era built. So like, anything finished in since 2018, things like that under the same codes, they actually are performing way better.
Wow.
Yeah.
What do you think? So Spencer's in Seattle, I think you know that. And so, we're actually going to Boston soon together, and we're talking about some of the most progressive markets in the country. But obviously, I think you guys are active in DC and obviously heavily active in New York. Let's start with New York because that's where I'm out of, and it's a very interesting market. What do you think some of the issues are at the moment in New York? Some of the conflicts maybe between what the industry is pushing versus obviously market pressures, interest rate wise versus like overseas global competition and a race to the bottom price wise. I'll be totally frank. I think New York's a sophisticated market, but it's also a messy market. And I think Boston has set themselves up to such a higher standard. So I wonder, we are in such close proximity in similar climate zones. What do you think the major differences are in the markets?
I think the projects are just bigger in scale in general in New York, especially in the city, right? So, which is where we do most of our stuff. And the fact that it takes 2 years from beginning of design till you start construction, right? That threw everybody out of whack when the interest rates went up and when the material pricing went up. So you've done this. You have a budget, you design a building, and you come out of design and you can't afford anything that you designed. So we saw a huge halt for about a year on a lot of projects that were supposed to be going in the ground. So that really stalled us last year. And a lot of people were waiting even to go into design because of it. So that was interesting. But I will say the local law 97 carbon emissions limits, they actually have had a very similar effect. It's not quite what's happening in Massachusetts, but we can show people right now that they will be below the 2030 thresholds and will not have to pay any fines if they go. So they have that push over there. And so we also have builders that it's just the way they build now. We have builders in New York that just build passive house. And that's just their standard, which is really amazing to see. And they're generally affordable housing developers or developers that are holding the property for a long time and are going to pay the utilities on the building. Even some market rate owners do that. They'll pay and then they'll just adjust the rent, right? So that's really where the drive comes from, is for the people with the ongoing, because they're seeing the savings too. And they're like, okay, I can build more affordable housing. I can underwrite this now. And so that's really been a momentum builder for some of those developers, the savings.
If we look back at things like LEED and the initiatives that they were trying to push and call it some of the pitfalls, and there's been new versions that kind of continue to try to improve upon, the last revision. What are some weak areas right now in the sort of passive house offering, passive house standard, or things that are being overlooked? Do you think developers are incentivized to build that way? What are some things that you wish the sort of network would focus on or push more?
Well, we have data for this now. We have seriously underestimated the domestic hot water use in multifamily buildings. Like I think we're at a third of what we're actually seeing. And the reason we know that is because of the local law 84 and 87s, where everyone's had bay reporting now since like 2018, right? We have like 17,000 multifamily buildings in New York City that we have data for. And we've been analyzing that over the last few months. And where, our models are saying for passive house, we use 8 kBTU per square foot. It's actually up in the mid-20s. So it's one of the big disconnects between what the actual use is and what the predicted use is. And that's always what people are, focused on. They're like, well, what good is this model? And I'm like, it's a certification model. It's not what we do for your utility analysis. So we have to like make them feel calm about that. But that's one of the areas where we're really overlooked. I think some good research and internal gains in multifamily. They barely need any heat. And I mean barely. And so we're holding these internal gains falsely low and beefing up the facade to a level where there would be a better balance in the heating and cooling if we weren't so crazy about this internal gains assumption. In multifamily buildings, even in Massachusetts, a colder climate and stuff, they're cooling dominated. Passive house buildings are cooling dominated. And so like some people tell us, oh, we've never even turned our heat on. I mean,
I'll say it right now. I've lived in high-rise buildings here in New York for over a decade now, and I don't know if I've ever used the heat. I mean, the solar heat gain is just phenomenal, and especially if you're on a higher floor with heat rise, it's just unfortunately I can't sleep well in the summer without the air conditioning on. But even today I have my windows open at night as well. It's 49 degrees outside, and it's interesting to what I find with passive house communities or sort of in these heating dominated climates, there's a lot more focus on occupant comfort and the occupant and considering that. And I feel like it's so easy to sit here and design these buildings and detail them perfectly, but ever so often do people really think about the occupant experience? And unless you're in this industry or know what to look out for, I don't think people care. And I think if you bring it to their attention, they're like, oh, that makes sense. But without that true experience of sitting in your living room, sitting in your office, wherever you are, and like interacting with the facade in a sense and understanding how it impacts your everyday life. I mean, in terms of getting natural sunlight, views, air tightness, whistling, being able to get natural ventilation. I mean, how many markets are we in where they don't have operable windows? You can't even open your window in the kitchen or in your bedroom. I mean, these things that almost you wish an architect had like a checklist or like a board, in their office. And as they were sitting, they're like, what would I want in my house? And then let's design that way. It's a little bit of a different lens perspective.
Yeah, I know it. I mean, they want their occupants to stay, right? Especially if they're holding the building. Turnover is no good for anybody. So that's that. But I think there's certain points that you hit on that don't occur to them, like you said,
So to sort of pivot over to the skin, because as much as we could talk about mechanical loads and hot water heating, I think one thing that is very overlooked is what skin type would comply with the passive house standard. And now that we have examples, let's talk about it like Cornell, which is a panelized rain screen system with punch windows. Sendero Verde, which is hand-laid brick with punch windows. And then is it Millennium Tower in Boston, which is a unitized curtain wall out of Canada. 3 vastly different facades in a high-rise application that passed the test. So let's start from there. What do you think the biggest misnomer might be about what can pass? Obviously, in my head, first thing goes to it has to be low window to wall ratio, or we can't do unitized curtain wall. But obviously, you've dismantled that. So do you still hear those same things over and over again?
Yeah, we basically, when we have our just intro to passive house with the team, we're like, you can build whatever you build fastest for your construction teams. What do you like? What's available in your area? What do you find to be the quickest way to get your building up? And we'll just help you detail it in a way that makes it passive house. Whether you need a thermal break, you need a little more insulation, and we'll make sure your air leakage points are met. But like any construction type can be passive house. Honestly, the hardest ones we have are our wood framed buildings up in outside of the city. More low rise stuff, especially if it has a vented roof assembly. Very tough. And there's a few reasons for that. The commercial big scale people are used to all of that exterior waterproofing, it becomes the air barrier basically, and they're used to those materials. And then you've got basically a flat roof, which is airtight and watertight, right? It needs to be watertight. So by default, it's airtight. And those connections are very easy. And a lot of it is like masonry foundations and things like that. So you're just on slabs. And so there's not a lot of potential air leaks, it's the windows mostly that we have to detail. When we go to wood frame construction, it's like, oh my God, okay, so here's some things we know. And they really have that's the hardest, but you can still do it. I mean, we have plenty of examples of it. But yeah, it's interesting. You would think the bigger buildings are the more complicated. No, they're used to that, and they use similar materials that what we would normally recommend for passive house.
So thank you. One thing, Spencer, I want to bring this to you that Mick brought up on our episode is the transition from your typical kind of 5x10, 4x10 curtain wall modules to mega panels to eliminate some of that thermal bridging at all the panel to panel intersections. Yet we can make it still work. So I like that approach, and I like how it does mitigate the thermal bridging. Yet, we have all these people coming out saying, oh, spandrel conditions with all that thermal bridging and, all your structural steel connections through your panel systems with all that thermal bridging. What's the miss? What's the disconnect? I feel like there's something either being pushed here that's not true or something that's being overlooked.
I think the biggest difference is, when you talk about larger volume projects, like bigger projects, commercial projects, and prefabricated wall systems, you're getting into the realm of like a product that's being used to clad the building, right? And you can do a project specific design, but usually a lot of the efficiency from those companies comes from like repeating the detailing for job over job. And so if they don't have the solution for the thermal break or for the mitigated like thermal bridge like at a stack joint or the airtight connection at joints in the field, it becomes like a modification to like their product to meet the needs of that job. And I think it's great that we mentioned Cornell because it kind of is an example of like what happened. It was like a watershed moment where you have this commercial project, this high-rise project, a lot of prefabrication, and it was sort of the golden goose of like, well, if we can do this, then we know that this is going to work like in the commercial like scale market, right? And I think that the more you have that, the more examples that you complete, whether it's a unitized project or more prefabricated wall systems, I think it builds kind of a comfort level with those types of systems to be able to address those problems. Whereas before you have any examples in the marketplace, there's kind of a hesitancy, there's a reluctance and maybe like a risk assessment that's like very difficult for a lot of these companies to overcome to say, yeah, we'll try and do this and we'll figure it out and kind of take the leap of faith in a way. But, I think inherently you can solve all of these problems. It just comes down to how effective is that facade company or product able to solve the problem and still maintain the cost control that's needed for the job, right? And it's interesting to compare it to the residential construction with wood frame because yeah, I can totally understand the difference. Like you're talking about something that's kind of handcrafted in a way with a lot of unique conditions, and it just becomes like real craftsmanship to address all the penetrations and discontinuities. Whereas with a commercial construction approach, we're like, make it as consistent as simple as possible to control the quality and make it, increase the amount of repetition to save on the overall cost of construction. So that's kind of how I look at it, and I think that invariably it's, the codes are pushing a lot of the product development standards. So as the building code, gets more aggressive in different like core markets, glazing systems will start to rise up to meet that requirement. Whereas before you're like, we want to do a passive house project with a unitized curtain wall. All the unitized curtain wall guys are like, oh man, like this is not something we've done before. It's like we're going to have to change a bunch of our components just to accommodate like the triple pane glass or mitigate all the thermal bridging. It's not to say it can't be done. It's just the incentive structure is a little different, I think.
Lois, I'm going to push you a little bit on the window side, and you have Spencer, a window expert, to back you up if you need it. So I didn't live in the passive house world for a long time, and my understanding was that if you did a true sort of thermal model or NFRC model, you can prove that your window met the U-value criteria, but technically, my perception was that a lot of the community wanted you to be in the database. You're passive house certified, whether it was a UPVC or aluminum product. What does that process look like for a manufacturer to get approved? A, B, do they need to be approved? And sort of what are the limiting factors for a manufacturer to get involved in the market?
So I think I'll let Spencer handle the certification part because he probably knows it way better than I do, but you do not need to be approved to be in the passive house market. All you need to do is show us the efficiencies of the product. So we need the frame, we need the spacer, we need the center glass. And if you can show us that, and if you don't have it, there's modelers out there that can do it for you. And it's not like $30,000 for a window. It's maybe a couple grand, depending on how complex your product is. So
you just screwed over all the engineering firms charging $30,000 to do the modeling. But anyway, go on.
No one I know would ever pay $30,000 to do
Yeah,
at least not for clients. So we've done it on a client by client basis where they wanted to use a particular product and we didn't have the right breakdown of the data. And so we've had them do the modeling. And honestly, most of the time it's for like a curtain wall system that has complex connections. And so, but for most of the punched windows, it's really not that hard if you've got a decent frame and spacer. So most everybody can, and honestly, they don't want you to know this, but if you can't meet the passive house criteria, there's mitigation you can do to still move forward and get certified by providing heat near the area so people don't have comfort problems and things like that. So they don't advertise it,
just
but
opened up the floodgates.
Well, I've always seen it. It's interesting you say it that way because it's really true. Like the way I look at it, the certificate is just a path of like convenience. It's like if you are putting together the PHPP model and you have a certified product, you're like, great, this is super easy. I just select the certified system, it fills in, like we're good to go. Everyone's comfortable with it. And if it's not certified, you're like, oh, all right. Go to the window vendor, be like, hey, we need you to give us all of your frame U values following the EN standard, assuming they know how to do that.
It worked because for years I didn't pursue. So clearly you guys scared us off.
Well, I think not all consultants are created equal. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to call anybody out, but there's definitely practitioners who are like, oh, you don't have a certified product, like move on, like we're not interested, and I think that's changing. That sentiment's changing a little bit as we become more like comfortable with how to apply the criteria. But, like initially for these big projects, there's a lot of like concern over not being able to like get there. So you wanted the certified product. You're like, we want to make sure if there's a certified option for a system that we can put on this, let's get it in there, and, it's also, I think it's a little bit more confusing now in some respects because there's two different passive house institutes operating in North America, which, means there's two different ways to certify product, two different sets of criteria, and it gets a little convoluted. But I think, as long as you have a competent glazing contractor or supplier, you can definitely get through it. I mean, you still have to prove the performance. Like that's, there's no getting around that, but it's not as hard as some people think.
Right. And
I don't want the two aluminum people on the call to sound biased, but is there still a perception that aluminum can't achieve it? Because I mean, there's just no denying that the vinyl market share in Canada, especially, but here in North America, it's just phenomenally grown over time. So what are you seeing?
No. What happened was when we first started Cornell, there was one choice. That was it. And they wanted metal because of the high rise and the wind and all of that stuff. We are so exposed out on the island there, so they wanted something that was
Spencer really sold someone.
I mean, we had the solution and we just came in and it was like, that was the thing. It was like, we've done this in Europe. That was the message we kept giving. We've done this before. Don't worry,
Don't worry.
It wasn't quite that simple, but it worked.
They worked. But for a while, what we were doing was every time we got a product through and like we got the EN values or whatever values we needed for the model, we just kept a database of them and we just kept sharing it with any new client we had. Here's windows we've used before, go price them, and they would come to us with a different one, and we were like, okay, let's see if we can get the values from the manufacturer. And so it just grew and grew. We don't even maintain it anymore because there's so many options out there now. But I think we maybe have used certified windows on, I don't know. I don't even know how many. We don't even request it anymore. We just get the values that we need.
Well, on Sendero Verde, there was a mix of vinyl and aluminum, right?
Yeah. The tower, the tall one, went to aluminum, right? Because it's 30 some stories. Yeah.
So beyond, you have your center of glass, which anybody can choose from. You have your edge of glass, which again, anybody can choose from. The frame's going to be proprietary or specific to the manufacturer. But beyond that, I mean, the interface between the window and the wall is probably most critical, right?
Yeah. It's the area in the building that you have the most chance for leakage, right? So the most linear footage of potential leakage. So we always focus on that window install, and whether they're doing a mock-up out of sequence ahead of time or the first window goes in, that's the one we test. We have the contractors around us. We show them any smoke that's coming in and out. And, you know, if it's good right off the bat, it's usually not. Usually it takes a little bit of, you know, tweaking a little here. You see something miss this corner. And like when they see it, it's like, oh, man, you guys are really, you're not kidding, right? So, but then it gets easier from there. And visual inspection is really all you need to do once they get it.
I mean, I'm a manufacturer. Spencer has been a manufacturer for a long time, and there's no denying. I think people want to paint this picture that they're perfect, but a lot of times, especially if you design custom windows, first window you build is going to fail. And the idea behind doing internal testing, especially before mass production, is you want to work out those kinks. Have you found on projects where you test that first PMU or you test that first unit on site and it fails? You know, you have an owner say, what the hell? You know, what did I pay for? What's with this whole team? And now you're running into issues on the site.
I will say there's only been a couple of times that they've been really bad, but some were ones that we didn't approve. But like on a couple of our jobs where we were involved from the beginning, um, the window installer wanted to field glaze the punched windows. And we were like, don't do it, don't do it. And they're like, no, we can do it, we can do it. The amount of extra money they spent on testing, and like you could just see the smoke coming through between the sash and the sill, you know, like just coming from the window itself, not the connection. And they're like, that's not failing. We're like, you see the smoke, right? You see it. They
You need a
hired an
different
outside
color?
person,
Yeah.
you know, yeah. They hired an outside testing lab to come in and test, and they came up with the same thing. And you know, the manufacturer was in and out. And it was a matter of the install instructions missed a certain key step, I believe. It was like one critical condition that they didn't get in the install instructions. Once they did that, they were fine. But like it took so much to get that. And it just another job we're working on. It was the same thing. They wanted to fill glaze and they're failing. They just can't get it. So
Yeah.
So I was an inspector. Did I do any inspections on Cornell with Vidaris for a long time? I spent my time in the field and I've spent my time seeing failed tests, wondering why they started testing 17 floors up, and then we have to go back and chase and all these issues you run into where you do maybe flood testing at the chicken head, and then you run into issues at your boot, but then once you have the panels on top, it's too late and you can't get to it. So,
yeah.
there's consequences of not catching these issues early. And the reality is a lot of times developers have to bite the bullet and sort of either take a Band-Aid approach, but at the end of the day, a lot of developers have still gotten their TCO, even if they have a leaking building, because it's not a life safety issue. So they might have occupancy and then be chasing leaks, for the subsequent 15 years or 3 years until they turn the
So
building over. Yeah, whatever it might be. But so what are the consequences, in a passive house high-rise type project where you're running into issues on the fourth floor, on the seventh floor, and especially like if you fail a blower door test, how do you then go back and pinpoint where the issues might be? It's a little bit more of a challenging problem, right?
it's a very challenging problem because you know, in a high rise, in like a 3-story building, you can get the whole air barrier together and do one test before they insulate on the interior. And you can walk around and see, and on a high rise, they're starting to close things in before they've even insulated on top. So you're losing your window of opportunity to catch mistakes. So you have to do those first ones. We make it we're adamant about it. We do contractor trainings on site and then we do mock-ups. Usually just one, but if they need another one, then we do another one. But like that really sets the stage. And sometimes it's a sequencing issue that nobody really realized is going to happen. You're like, oh, we can't get this tape on until the window's here, but then you can't reach the tape. And so they got to redo the sequencing. So we've had some of that happen, but it's always very early on. We never ever wait to the 3rd floor, 4th floor. We always do the first.
Have you seen anything unique in terms of, I've also spent a lot of time in like curtain wall production facilities and been really impressed by some contractors who have like really thorough QA/QC protocols where, it's an assembly line. So you keep walking at each step and it's almost like a coloring book that explains why you're doing this step. And yes, it's annoying. You have to put the primer on, but it's because of this. And so the same thing can be applied to the field. Sometimes these steps seem like rigorous, or just like, you might have contractor, superintendent, or laborers that might say like, just slap some caulk on it or do this or do that, and it's fine. And I've been doing this 30 years. I know what I'm doing, type of thing. Is there anything unique in terms of like how to educate? Is it really critical to educate the entire project team about not only what the steps are, but why they matter, so that they understand you skip this happens, so that everybody understands the ramifications?
So, you know, we've done a lot of buildings where the crews had never done a passive house before. But I will say this, if you have a contractor who's like, this is the type of construction we'd like to get more work of, and I'm going to put my people through training, it's like a night and day situation for them. So it makes our jobs a lot easier. Like, it makes the friction just go away, because they actually did it at Cornell. Like, halfway through the process, they went through tradesperson training. Kevin Brennan did their tradesperson training on site for them. And they had a whole bunch of people, I think it was like 15 people, go through it. And the way they were talking before that training versus after was like night and day. They were like, this is not how we typically do things. This is not how we typically do things. And I was like, this is not your typical building. And so they came back after this training and they were like, where's the leak? If you leak, like we were doing interim testing, where's the leak? They had their own smoke pens. They had signs up all over the building, do not penetrate this barrier, like night and day. So from the consultant's perspective, you can do it without a trained crew. It just makes it so much easier.
All right, this was fun. I really appreciate you both coming on. Very informative, and I'm sure there's going to be follow-up questions. But yeah, we'll be in Boston. Spencer and I will be together in Boston and New York in the coming weeks. So maybe we'll go look at some of the projects and do a highlight of them. But Lois, thank you for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thank you both.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.